Good morning and welcome to this week's home church study. Throughout the month of January, we are taking the time to do some topical studies, and we're using resources developed and given for free by the very talented and very generous people at thebibleproject.com. So if you want to look a little bit deeper into any of the resources that we're using or reuse these in another context or setting, everything we're using today and throughout the month of January is available at the website bibleproject.com, which is on the bottom of the screen below me. The topic we're going to be looking at today is holiness. Holiness is another one of those words that is used all the time in Christian circles. It's this big idea, this great theme that's woven throughout the scriptures and used in a number of ways. And the way we understand holiness has huge implications for the way we think about and understand everything in life. God himself is described as holy, and his presence is talked about in terms of holiness. When Moses approached the burning bush, God himself requested that Moses take off his shoes or his sandals, for the ground he was standing on was holy ground, simply because God's presence was manifested in that place. The Israelites were called to be a nation set apart for God, to be a holy nation. This idea and this theme of holiness is everywhere right throughout the scriptures. Take a minute to talk about this if you're watching with someone else. In your own understanding, what does it mean to be holy? What is holiness? If you're watching on your own, perhaps you want to jot down a few thoughts and see how these ideas develop or maybe become enriched as we dig deeper into this topic together. Now that we have a starting point, let's watch this week's Bible Project video on the topic holiness.
You've probably heard the word holy before, or at least sang it in a church song once or twice. And for most people, this idea is really just connected to being a morally good person. So God is holy because he's morally perfect.
Yeah, that is part of it. But in the Bible, the idea of holiness is even bigger and more rich. What it's really describing is how God is the creative force behind the whole universe. He's the one and only being with the power to make a world full of such beauty and life. And so all these abilities, they make God utterly unique, which is the meaning of the word holy. So a helpful way to think about God's holiness is by using the sun as a metaphor. The sun is unique, at least within our solar system, and it's really powerful. It's the source of all this beautiful life on our planet. And so you could say that the sun is holy. And you can actually take this metaphor even further in that the whole area around the sun is also holy.
Yeah, because the closer you get to the sun, the more intense it gets.
Yeah, exactly. So that very power and goodness that generates all this life is also dangerous. I mean, the sun, if you get too close, will annihilate you. And in the same way, there's this paradox at the heart of God's own holiness, because if you're impure, his presence is dangerous to you. And not because it's bad, but because it's so good. And so the first time we see this paradox of God's holiness, it's in the story of Moses and the burning bush.
So God tells Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And Moses covers his face in fear, and God says, hey, don't come any closer. It's intense.
It's actually that intensity of God's holiness that's explored even more in the stories about Israel's temple, which was the main place where God's holy presence was located. And at the center of the temple was this room called the Most Holy Place, the hot spot of God's presence. And whether you're an Israelite living in the land around the temple or a priest working right in the temple, you're in proximity to God's holy presence, which is dangerous.
Yeah, this is a problem. So how's it supposed to work?
Well, in the Bible, the solution is that you need to become pure.
So like being morally pure.
Yeah, and that's easy enough to understand. But the Bible spends a lot of time talking about another kind of purity, being ritually pure, which is a state where you separate yourself from anything related to death, like touching things like diseased skin or dead bodies or even certain bodily fluids. All these make you impure. And becoming ritually impure isn't necessarily sinful. What's wrong is waltzing into God's presence when you're in an impure state. And so that's why God gave the Israelites very clear instructions for knowing when they were impure, steps to become pure, so that they could go into the temple again.
So that's what the book of Leviticus is about.
Right. But it doesn't stop there. This idea keeps developing. So later in the scriptures, we find this really interesting story by a prophet named Isaiah. And he has this crazy vision where he's in the temple and he's right in God's presence. He's totally terrified.
Yeah, he knows the rules. He shouldn't even be in there. And he's worried about being destroyed.
And then this crazy creature called a seraphim.
Yeah, that is a crazy creature.
Totally. So it flies over with a hot coal, and then it sears Isaiah's lips with the coal and says something really weird. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.
So this burning coal somehow makes Isaiah pure.
Yeah, it's remarkable because normally if you touch something impure, it transfers its impurity to you. But now here's this new idea where you have this coal, this very holy and pure object, and it touches Isaiah, and it transfers its purity to him. Isaiah is not destroyed by God's holiness. He's transformed by it. I mean, the implications of this are just huge. But there's one more development. This time from another prophet, Ezekiel. And he has this vision where he's standing at the temple and he sees water trickling out from it. And then that water turns into a stream, and then it grows into a deep river that starts flowing through the desert, leaving this trail of green trees behind it. And then it flows into the Dead Sea, making everything fresh and alive.
So instead of becoming pure first and then going into the temple, here God's holiness comes out from the temple, making things pure and bringing them to life. What does it all mean?
So we don't know until we meet this man, Jesus. And he claims that he's fulfilling all of these ancient visions, but in surprising new ways. So Jesus, he went around touching people who are impure, people with skin diseases, a woman with chronic bleeding, or dead people. And when he touches them, their impurity should transfer over to Jesus. But instead, Jesus' purity transfers to them and actually heals their bodies.
Jesus is like that holy coal in Isaiah's vision.
Right. And Jesus claimed that he was the human embodiment of God's own holiness, and that he and his followers were now God's temple, so that through them, God's holy presence would go out into the world and bring life and healing and hope. And so this is why Jesus described his followers as having streams of living water flowing out of them.
So this is our part of the story where we find ourselves now, but where's this all heading?
So the last pages of the Bible end with a final vision about God's holiness. And this time it's by a guy named John. And in his vision, we see the whole world made completely new. The entire earth has become God's temple. And Ezekiel's river is there, flowing out of God's presence, immersing all of creation, removing all impurity, and bringing everything back to life.
How did your understanding of God's holiness develop as you watched the video? Did you gain any new insights into holiness? Isaiah 6, 1-7. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. The prophet Isaiah has a wild and beautiful vision where he witnesses Yahweh on the throne and heavenly creatures calling out, "Holy, holy, holy." Isaiah is unraveled by the sight and aware that he might be destroyed because of his impurity. But then a creature, the Sephrim, touches Isaiah's lips with a hot coal from God's altar and tells him, "Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for." Instead of being destroyed by this burning coal, it somehow makes Isaiah pure. Normally in the Bible, if something pure touches someone impure, the impurity transfers and defiles the purity. But Isaiah's vision presents a new idea. Now we see a purified object transferring its purity onto someone impure. Isaiah is not ruined like he feared, he is transformed in the presence of God's holiness. Take note that the coal in Isaiah's vision is taken from the altar, the place where sacrifice is made. Reflect on the sacrifice Jesus made for you in order to say your guilt is taken away. What comes to mind? Mark 5:21-43. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman who was there had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciple answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. In Leviticus, we learn that sickness, blood, and death are impure, which makes sense. For example, we tend to step back when people cough, sterilize cuts, and wash our hands after preparing raw chicken. But impure meant that you could not enter into God's holy temple because impure things defiled holy things, and impure things were destroyed in the presence of God's purity. But Isaiah's vision revealed that this order could be reversed. When Jesus arrives on the scene, we see him fulfill and demonstrate the powerful implications of Isaiah's vision. Jesus becomes the holy coal that atones for sin and destroys death and sickness without destroying the person. He doesn't avoid people who have impurities, rather, he touches them in order to bring wholeness wherever he goes. The sick are made whole, and the dead come alive. Where are signs of spiritual, moral, or relational decay present in our community, in our nation? Where are people hurting and excluded? And out of all the places that you consider, what do you think are the most neglected and the most in need spaces? If you're watching via Facebook, why not use the comments to share some of those neglected spaces in our community? In relation to the last question, why do you think many people try to avoid these spaces of decay, hurt, and isolation? Why do you think Jesus intentionally goes into these places? As you consider the passages in Mark, what do you notice about Jesus' approach? In relation to the neglected spaces you've considered, what are 3 possible ways you could join or invite other Jesus followers to live as agents of God's healing holiness in that place? What practical steps are needed to make these ideas a reality? Again, if you're joining us on Facebook, why not use the comment sections to share some of these practical ideas? I'm going to invite you to spend some time in prayer now as we listen to a song that's going to help us reflect. Think about those places of hurt and neglect that you listed and pray over these spaces. Pray that God's presence and his healing holiness will be felt in these places, and ask God to show you and direct you to be his representatives in these spaces. Allow him to use you to bring healing as his Spirit works in and through you.
Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word. Spirit of the living your voice. We're hanging on every word.
Thanks for joining us this week as we've taken a deeper look at the holiness of God, and be sure to join us next week as we look into the image of God. And now I leave you with a benediction from the book of Jude. Now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy, to the only God, our Saviour through Jesus Christ, our Lord, be glory, majesty, dominion and authority before all time and now and forever. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.